Hi, thank you. Thanks, Kirsty. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our talk on coastal data and its application. Yeah, thank you for Kirsty for inviting us to speak today, and hopefully you'll all gain something from this talk. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'll pass over to Andy to introduce himself, and then we'll get started. So I am Claire French. I'm a Senior Coastal Process Scientist based at Canterbury City Council. I've been there since 2010, working under the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme. The role is sort of oversees the data collection, analysis and reporting for Isle of Grain to Beachy Head. These sort of secondary role, or the secondary function of my role, is to work under the East Kent Engineering Partnership and provide coastal advice and reports for the sort of wider coastal area for local authority and Environment Agency, both of which use coastal data on a daily basis. Andy.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, I'm Andy Stevens. I, as of January this year, have set up my own consultancy, and I specialise in writing business cases for flood defence grant and aid, and doing studies to sort of justify flood schemes, especially on the coast and especially based down in Kent, because former to setting up, I worked at Canterbury City Council and led on the appraisal work and licensing work there. And prior to that, I also worked on the monitoring programme with data collection and analysis right at the start of my career. So thank you.
Okay, so we will get started. Oops. So sorry, it's thick. It seems a bit sticky. Hopefully the slides will transition easy enough. This talk is based in sort of on 5 sections. We'll start with available coastal data, which partly monitoring programme, but also partly sort of the remit of data available. We'll go on to quantifying coastal change. So this is looking at volumetric calculations, profile changes, and sediment budgets. We'll then move on more specifically to looking at beach designs, beach management and construction. So that's the sort of the practical implementation of the results. And then lastly, we'll pull all of it together in a case study, which is for an outline business case. I'll be taking sections 1 and 2, and then I'll pass over to Andy for section 3, 4 and 5. And then I think we're having a Q&A session at the very end. So firstly, we're looking at available coastal data. So this one is, the first one's looking at topographic beach data. So as I mentioned, this is available through the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme. For those that are unaware, the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme started in Southeast, at least in 2003. I think there's about 7 or 8 different regions within England and Wales who also have their own monitoring programmes. So specifically, the topographic data collection for us is in-house. There's sort of 2 key elements, which is looking at beach profile cross sections, and then we're looking at the sort of full coverage of data, which can allow us to sort of create 3D beach models. I'll just very quickly touch on how it's collected. So sort of back in 2003, one of the sole methods for collecting this data was mounting GPS equipment onto a rucksack or a survey pole and walking the lines along the beach. We do still do that at Canterbury, although it's very manual, but the data collection has advanced, so we can mount this equipment onto a quad bike to increase efficiency. Probably sort of 7 or 8 years ago, we started to move to static laser scans, which really increases the point cloud, the amount of data that we're collecting, and full coverage is a bit slower, but much data, more sort of data heavy. We can extract the beach profiles either through the 3D grids, or we can, like the picture on the bottom right, you can put the GPS equipment on a detail pole and collect the data manually. Moving forwards in time, so we're probably looking 5 years ago, maybe sort of 7 years ago, we're looking to go for mobile data scanners, so mobile laser scanners. It's a bit like sort of Google Street View. We can mount a camera onto the quad bike, drive along the beach, and it collects data much like a static scanner, so the point density is much greater. And then more recently, again, sort of 5 or 6 years ago, we're looking at UAVs. So again, this is an output from a UAV data set. You can see the difference in comparison to the points that we had on the maps in the previous screen. You can use this data set for beach analysis and also structures. So we're looking at assets. And then lastly, again, it does just give updated aerial photos. Moving on to aerophotography, part of the monitoring program data that's available, it's all freely available on the coastal monitoring website, is auto-rectified aerials. For the majority of the frontages, we've got aerials from sort of 2003, 4, 5, right up to current day. We collect them every few years. They can either be used, in this instance, Dungeness Peninsula, just to gauge sort of linear meterage accretion, sort of basic visual assessments, or it can just be used as underlaying in your GIS programs to overlay your data and as a visual tool. Moving on to structure surveys. So this is, again, it's just the available data or sort of data that we need to use for all our projects. This is essentially a continuation of the beach profiles. So the transects go up and over the defences. This can either be a one-off or we can do it every few years. And again, this just provides a basic schematic with all the elevations of and the detail to do with the defences behind the beach. Where we don't have that information, again, there might be this information available through local authorities or EA, or if you're doing it on a project by project basis, this is something that we commissioned ourselves. So the structures topographic surveys give us all the data for the visible defences. However, we don't actually know what's necessarily going on underneath or the buried part of the structure. Data that we've collected before is through trial holes, where we have uncovered the buried section of the defence, either to ascertain the schematics and the levels, but also it can be used for to aid the condition assessment. As part of that, we can either draw up, or we would already have structure schematics. Again, they'll give us the elevation and the geometric design. Alternatively, something that we've done in the southeast is we have commissioned boreholes. If one of the projects we were working on was a flood defence fund and we needed to ascertain its structural integrity. So we ended up coring through it. And again, we've got this data. Some local authorities may hold it as well. Moving on to sort of live wave and water levels. Quite a lot of this data is available on the Coastal Monitoring website. There's a real-time page which shows the network of wave buoys and tide gauges, and many of these have been in place for 15, 20 years. That data links through to the CFAS website, so there are additional wave buoys on there as well, so you can use both of them interchangeably. The Coastal Monitoring website has all the tide levels available for all the tide gauges around the network for a week at a time. It's always a rolling week. There's real-time data on there for wave periods, swell waves and tide levels. In addition, we dial into the National Sea Level Facility, Tide and Sea Level Facility website for storm surge data. Again, this can be used to aid emergency planning for storms, and it can just predict surge levels for if you're going to attend site. Then we're moving on to extreme water levels. So the JBA produced on behalf of the Environment Agency a coastal flood boundary conditions. This was an update of the earlier work. So this was 2018 to update the extreme water levels. That's available on the Gov website, and we also use the UK CP18 climate change predictions, both large data sets available online. And then lastly, for sort of raw data, recycling logs, these are quite crucial for looking to understand beach management. It also allows us to create a do-nothing scenario and sort of really strip back the as surveyed data to understand sort of natural processes. Monitoring program leads should have the majority of this information because it should be incorporated into their sort of annual reporting. If not, local authorities and environment agencies should also have details of their recycling or replenishment works. Now moving on to quantifying coastal change. So I'll start with the basics. So the profile change. So the graph in the top is it's in one of our program SANs. This is a profile cross-sectional data. You could manipulate this data in MATLAB, Python, Excel, SANS. It is just sort of a basic text file. The red profile on on the right, but it's also seaward, is 2003 position, and then we've got the black one on the left. the landward, which is the current day position. We can do sort of basic visual assessment that that beach profile is quite clearly eroding. The monitoring programme has got beach profiles in some places every 25 metres. That's quite a lot of data to analyse, even for the enthusiastic amongst us. So we've created a tool which shows the entire frontage. So we've broken them into survey units, but it plots all the beach profiles. So along the x-axis, we've got location, which is our beach profile. And then on the y-axis, we've got beach CSA in metres squared. And the box and whiskers represent every profile. It's the highest the profile's ever been, the lowest it's ever been, and we can also plot its current position. So it provides an overview for the entire section of coast. Alternatively, you can just do simple sort of mathematics, take one away from the other and get a difference. So fairly basic. We can represent this in GIS using these sort of thematic lines. So they're color coded based on the percentage erosion. And again, just displaying percentage or actual change. Not all our beaches are bright red. I've picked one that's a bit more interesting. These are produced from the monitoring programme, but this is quite simple to sort of replicate for your own projects and different time periods. Starting to move on to volumetrics. Again, we'll start with the very basic. I'm sure most of you are aware, if we've got one digital ground model, we can take it away from the previous set and it will give us a difference model coloured map. We can overlay polygons so that we can do some spatial interrogation, and it will quantify the loss or gain experienced on the beach. So the two sections in bright red on the north, that is the section for the profile that I just showed you with the sort of 50-metre retreat. So again, quite sort of nice graphics to illustrate your data. Alternatively, you want to start to look at total beach volume. That's quite handy in some circumstances. So we can use a plane, whether that be sort of rock level, chalk platform, clay level, or just an arbitrary 0 metres above ordnance datum. You can create sort of what we'd call a fake grid and do a difference model with your most recent data set to give you the current total beach volume. You can extrapolate that data sort of forwards or backwards to be able to give you a total volume change graph similar to this. This is purely measured on as surveyed data. So the large jump in 2010 to 11 is actually a beach replenishment scheme, but it's actually masked in the monitoring programme data if you're just taking that data on face value. So that's what you need the recycling logs for. So then if we go to sort of a more in-depth analysis, so we're looking at, or for this we've used Sediment Budget. I won't go into it in too much detail because it's not a presentation on Sediment Budget, but I will just sort of recap what it is that we've done. So we took the Rosati and Krauss Sediment Budget analysis system method, slightly amended it to include natural losses. The equation's the sort of grainy thing in the middle. We know all of these inputs with the exception of the output. The output will be the longshore drift rate. So the Q input is the volume of sediment entering the cell. The delta V is the volumetric change. That's the survey change, which masks any human intervention. Then we've got the material deposited on the frontage, material removed from the frontage, and then any losses which is attributed to attrition, abrasion, or just associated with replenishment or recycling. So I will just very quickly run through the calculation. So my sort of two grey sticks on the screen are my terminal structures. If we start with cell A, nothing's coming in, it's a terminal structure, so we know our Q input. The surveyed value is 2000, so we were going to assume that 2000 is going straight into cell B. Our recycling logs suggest 3000 meters cubed is coming in from recycling and 1000 from replenishment, which takes or increases the sediment transport rate to 6000. Due to the calculations to natural losses, so this is your attrition, your losses from recycling, we've calculated 400 coming out of the cell, so it's now reducing the longshore transport. Then we start looking at cell B, so there's a recorded gain on site of nearly 2,500, which would suggest that over 3,000 is now going past the terminal structure. Looking at the recycling logs, we know that 3,000 meters cubed was included as part of that recycling scheme. So now only 150 meters cubed is going past the terminal structure. But miraculously, that's all natural losses, and our sediment budget closes with the zero residual. Once we started to do that, we can do that for any given length of coastline, and essentially it's just a process that works through the polygons that we've provided, or that you can designate, and we can produce something that like this. This is quite in depth, and it does show the summary sediment budget. Just as a side note, because we've got 20 years worth of data, the different models that we would calculate would be the most current day. So we've got 2022 to 2003, and we do an average annual calculation for all of these, all the recycling, all the different models, and all of the transport rates. So we would consider that fairly reliable. It's a sort of an average of 20 years, and it masks any large storm events or any sort of unusual data sets to give us with some confidence some trends. That's quite detailed. That we could sort of strip that back to just plot the natural trends. So if we basically undid everything, we took out anything that was added in, we added anything in that was taken out, we can then, it leaves us with sort of a natural trend. If that works hadn't been done, these are the sort of volumes or trends that we could expect. Then lastly, again, we can just look at sediment transport. So we could just plot the transport rate arrows, which if there's an area where beaches sediment transport rates massively increasing, then it can highlight possibly an area of weakness along the coast if you didn't want a high transport rate there, which can start to sort of look at beach management options. So I'll hand over to Andy.
Cool, thank you, Claire. Yeah, so in this section, I'm going to touch upon creating defence sections to represent your coastline. Then I'm going to touch upon two failure mechanisms for beach and seawall defences, which are overtopping of the defence and undermining. And then I'm going to touch upon trigger levels for beach design. Yeah, so this is probably one of the most crucial stages. Before you start out modelling a beach at all, you need to know what your different defences are. So you start by splitting them into representative sections that are based on the sea wall type, the crest level, any sort of apron you got in front, any other features, whether that's offshore breakwaters, etc. And it's a bit of a trade-off here, because you don't want to have so much detail that you have hundreds of sections, because that is, as I'll go into later, there's a lot of analysis done per section. But equally, you don't want to be so broad brush that you represent a whole, say, flood basin frontage in a single section, because you might miss some level of detail that would actually tell you where your critical pinch points are. So for this, but yeah, yes, for this example, it's the town of Whitstable. There's a large flood basin present along essentially the entire frontage. There's about 20 sections, just because the seawall, it was built mostly through the 50s and 60s with some minor work since, but there's just various bits that have bull nose and don't have bull nose, and various different types of wall that are essentially, because like a lot of the southeast and the sort of east coast of England, they were built after the 1953 storm surge, and a lot of times it was basically a panic to get some seawalls built, so you'd never have a repeat of that event, and it was fairly piecemeal, and you often have sort of access to beaches that so you need to change the design of the seawall to allow access, etc. So often when you look in detail, they're pretty complicated. Manual, but what we did at Canterbury was into a spreadsheet, so it essentially allowed us to model various different defence types, still with a fair bit of manual input, but a lot quicker than using the online tool. Cheers, Claire. Sorry, I apologise because only one of us can present. Claire's having to guess where my slides are coming, so bear with us on that one. This graph shows when we model overtopping, both, so we're modelling it for the seawall, but with the beach in front of it as well. So what we do is we model a series of beach configurations, and then on this graph, we've translated those beach configurations into cross-sectional areas. So along the x-axis, you can see cross-sectional area of beach, and along the y-axis is the level of overtopping you would expect. And the different lines represent different standards of protection. So the red line, we've just plotted a 1 in 200 level of protection to demonstrate that if you know what your allowable overtopping rate is, and that will be based on what you're protecting against, you can then read off what level of beach is required.
Andy, just to check you there, I think we're having some connectivity issues. He's definitely frozen. Sorry, everybody. Bear with us one moment. Andy's going to leave and rejoin for us. Wouldn't be a presentation without some IT issues, eh?
Hopefully he can jump back in. If not, I'll give his slides a go. Just a reminder to everybody who's listening, there is a question and answer function on Zoom. So if anybody has any burning questions for Claire or Andy, feel free to put them into the Q&A box and we'll pick those up at the end. Here we go, Andy's coming back. Let's just see if he's
Yes, I apologise about that. Technical.
Hi, Andy.
Doesn't tend to happen in person. Hopefully
no problem.
Sorry, so I'm gonna, did we get any of this slide, Claire?
Yeah, we did. I think we just started on the next slide. So if you want to pick
brilliant.
Up from there, that would be great. Thanks, Andy.
Fantastic, yeah, great. So this plot then shows similar, because we've modelled a range of beach configurations, the latest spreadsheet, we allow for up to 100 different configurations. So that's different sizes of beach berm, different elevations, and different beach slopes. And this graph basically synthesizes all of that data, and it shows the maximum overtopping you could get, the minimum, and then obviously that range. And the point data there is just validation from various different beach profiles. So the data collected as part of the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme, as Claire explained, that's basically different profiles within this representative section. And again, using this graph, we can read off the level of overtopping you'd expect per beach size. And because we've modelled a whole different range, when you're looking at your do nothing for the future, you can sort of look at the worst case. So if the beach were to orientate itself in the worst case position with regards to overtopping, you can sort of know what to expect. So it means you're not under predicting future risk. Great, so the next one is undermining. This is a bit briefer. The methods we've used are fairly simple because generally speaking, the failure mechanism here is that your beach in front of the defence gets washed away and it exposes the beach toe. And then you can either get wash out of fill material or in some cases sort of overturning of the defence. But typically what you need to know here is your structure toe. So on the right-hand side, we've got a schematic. That's the best. If there's an as-built schematic from when the seawall was constructed, they should have plotted on where they built the fence to. But amazingly, not everyone does this. And you also need to know where your bedrock level is. So in this example, they've plotted the clay level on there. if this is missing, you can look at coastal monitoring data, because it's surveyed right down to sort of mean low water springs where possible. You can often see where the bedrock level is and estimate it from that. If you don't have that, for instance, if there's always shingle or sand on top of the bedrock and you don't have schematics and you haven't been able to do any site investigation, you can use the wealth of coastal monitoring data, which is the bottom graph, to look at essentially what was the lowest beach level ever recorded. So where you've got 20 years of data, you know the beach has never been above, say, 1 meters ordnance datum. So if you assumed your tow level was there, then that's a fairly good working assumption, because what you absolutely don't want to do is underpredict where your tow is. If you're saying your tow's at 1 meter and it's actually at 0 meters, all you're doing is you're having a little bit of extra beach, and which is obviously a conservative approach. And typically we've modelled the entire southeast, and we found that in all but a very few handful of cases, overtopping generally requires a larger beach than undermining does, which means you don't sort of need the same level of detail. So trigger levels. So as I said, we've looked at overtopping and undermining as failure mechanisms. So for both of those approaches, we now have a cross-sectional area of beach that's required to provide protection against that failure mechanism. And from that, you can then start to design your beach. So in the sort of terminology we've used, critical gives you your standard of protection. So if your beach is on critical, you are just about by the skin of your teeth providing the level of protection you said you are. And then we have buffer zones, which we call maintenance and design. Sometimes they're combined. The Environment Agency often use terminology alarm and crisis. Obviously, different terminology has different emotions attributed to it. We started fresh when we did the regional beach management plans across the southeast, but we appreciate that different people use different terms. And with the design and maintenance level, you can actually go back to the monitoring data. You can look at what is the worst erosion we have on record, and you can apply that as your buffer, because then you've got a scientifically based buffer level, rather than just sort of having a bit of guesswork, which may well have happened in the past. So this slide shows, again, the coastal monitoring data going back in time. So you've got survey data along the x-axis and the cross-sectional area along the y-axis. We can essentially plot where the beach was with regards to the actual trigger levels over time. And what we do on the graph, which Claire briefly showed, is summarize this data with a minimum value, a maximum value, and then the current value. And there you have this graph. Again, I'll go through it briefly because Claire did share, but essentially this graph can give us an overview of an entire coastline. So the 4B SU06 refers to the monitoring unit name, which comes from the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme. We tend to work in those units because it's just how we work. But sometimes a business case might be for a small part of that frontage. Sometimes you might be looking at a scheme for several units. So obviously with these graphs, it's an Excel-based tool we developed. If you want to change the range, you just change the setup of the spreadsheet. But it's a very quick way of telling you in context what your current beach is. So for this example, you can see that middle section. There's a lot of very big beaches that are well above design level. So although it's alarming to see the current beach is at the bottom of that entire data set, it's still well above design levels. So where you have residents telling you that they're losing beach and you need to get in and do something, you can sort of calmly show them this graph and explain that they have lost beach, but they're still not at flood risk. And another way of displaying the same data, similar data. So where that graph was for the design for the 1 in 200 level, you can, going back to those overtopping graphs, actually calculate what your current standard of protection is before you've done any work. So for this example, you've got a bit of a range. It's mostly above the 1 in 200, which is the standard, but for varying reasons, there's certain beach profiles which are below standard. And obviously as part of an appraisal, you go into a lot more depth and look at why these are below standard. whether you can actually hold enough beach physically for that standard of protection, or whether you need to put in mitigating factors, whether that's a larger rear wall or some sort of flood resilience behind the flood defence. And then this graph shows the exact same frontage, but for 100 years' time, accounting for climate change. As Claire said, the data on climate change estimates is readily available. The Environment Agency provide predictions for use in flood defence grant and aid applications. So this shows you that if you were to do absolutely no work on this frontage, what would happen to the standard of protection? As you can see, it's a fairly a bad picture. A lot of the frontage wouldn't even be a 1 in 1 year. You'd essentially be expecting flooding several times a year. It can be a really valuable tool for both engaging with the public in areas where perhaps you can't do work, or engaging where you're looking at different schemes and you're demonstrating the fact, you know, why are you doing something outside my house? Why have you got trucks on the beach? Why are you building a seawall? You can explain why that is. So the next part of the talk will be on actual managing these works on site. So we've gone into the sort of theoretics of how you might design a beach, and now we're going to the practicalities. So it was a little bit shoehorned in here. We originally had a whole section on incident response, but essentially the data that's available is fantastic. As Claire said, we have live data on the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme. You've got tools like the National Tide and Sea Level Facility that give you surge predictions up to 3 days ahead. Between the two, you can very quickly both model what sort of events you might have a few days in advance, but also monitor storm events as they occur. So you can see what sort of waves you're getting, and it can just help you. Typically at Canterbury, when we have an emergency, a flood emergency, or a storm big enough to trigger one, we'll have people on site actually physically monitoring, and then you'll have someone in the control room looking at this live data, WhatsApping out what the water levels are, what we need to do about it. It's especially useful for councils such as Canterbury that have a lot of floodgates that may or may not need closing. So this data really helps you not to under or over respond to an event. And then equally with incidents, the Regional Coastal Monitoring Programme provides, I believe they're now called incident surveys, they were previous post-storm surveys. So if there were triggers for storms based on significant wave heights, they will actually come in as soon as safely possible and profile some of those beaches. So you can actually get the beach at its worst, which is incredibly useful for business cases, because if you can't capture the beach at its worst, it's hard to demonstrate sometimes what the full risk is. So going into planning works, whether you've just had a storm event and you're doing remedial works to fix what was broken, or whether you're just doing more strategic long-term planning, the data that we have can really quickly be used to plan your works effectively. So this graph shows the purple line is the current beach. So that's what we actually have. And then the green, orange and red solid lines refer back to those trigger levels. And then the red dotted line shows you what the beach profile will be after the works. So for this example, it's actually an overfilled groin bay where we can actually extract beach material for use elsewhere where there's not enough. So very quickly we tend to use spreadsheet tools because it's what we know, but there's various ways of doing this. You can essentially put the monitoring data in context, and it really helps. Having these sort of diagrams on site is a lot less vague than just telling a contractor, oh, could you just dig out some beach for me and move it around? And it also gives you a bit of assurance that if you're telling them to move 1,000 cubic meters, you can actually have the beach and you're not actually going to start jeopardizing the standard of protection. And then a very simple plot. So this actually uses the volumetric data to similar to that profile data, but for the beach volumes. And this graph, depending on how big your computer screen is, obviously in person we don't have this problem on a big screen, but the squares just show you the actual lorry loads of beach material. We found we work in cubic meters.
I think Andy's disappeared for the moment again. Sorry about that. Unsure if Andy is still able to hear us, but you may need to just rejoin again. Another opportune moment to remind everybody if they have any questions, just to post them into the Q&A section for me. Thank you.
Apologies.
Hi, Andy.
Yeah.
No problem. We were just hearing about how normally measurements of volume are made in cubic meters, and you were talking about lorry loads.
Yeah, cool. If it happens again with my laptop, I might just have to ask Claire to jump in and do the best she can. But yes, so essentially it's about making it as practical as possible for contractors. So if you knowing the capacity of the trucks you'll use on site, you can give them actually what they need in lorry loads. Great. So the final thing I'm going to touch upon is just groin design. So again, when you're designing a groin, you obviously need to know what beach you want to hold, which would be your design beach. But you also really need to know what your minimum beach is on record. And that's where the coastal monitoring data is really valuable. Because what can tend to happen is one or two things. Either you under-design your groin, and then there's a risk that your bottom plank level or your whaling, which is sort of sheet piling, will get undermined in a storm event, or you do the opposite, which is over design. You build the entire groin right down to bedrock at massive expense, and actually you didn't need to. So knowing what your minimum beach is, you can do a fairly good design. You might just about be able to see the lines on the rock groin diagram to the bottom right there. So essentially, when we were cost engineering this rock groin, we're building it so it, looking at the minimum beach ever on record, that size wouldn't undermine it. And with this, because you're putting the rock groin in there, you're actually reducing sediment transport. So you wouldn't actually expect to ever reach that minimum, but it just gives you sort of a good design, beach design to work off. And then post-works appraisal, again, with the coastal monitoring programme, as well as sort of these post-storm surveys, they can do post-work surveys, or I really encourage any beach managers to encourage you to do that. Once you've done the work, get a topographic survey done, because it's really valuable to have the beach at its worst, at its best. And also then you can quantify how much beach was actually moved as a sort of validation to make sure your contractor has actually done their job. On the right-hand side, it's just a very quick picture showing before and after. So the visual record is really helpful, but the topographic record is absolutely invaluable. Great, so now I'm gonna summarize a lot of what we talked about in a case study. This is for the Whitstable Horsebridge to Harbour Beach Replenishment Scheme in Whitstable on behalf of Canterbury City Council. So this is the frontage. It's a fairly small area either side of Whitstable Harbour, but essentially it's just quite vulnerable because a lot of the other coastline has had beach replenishments in the last 20, 30 years, but this section hasn't. The beach changes are actually very small in Whitstable, but just as a product of climate change, the standard of protection has been creeping down to the extent where we've designed this scheme, and it's now, to jump to the end, it's now got funding from the Environment Agency, and it should be constructed next year. So using what we touched upon before, beach trends, this graph just gives you the beach profiles in your study area on the left and then time on the right. We model all the way to 100 years in the future, which is sort of standard practice. Normally in appraisal, you'd either go to 100 years or sort of the lifetime of your asset. It's very rare you go more than 100 years, but sometimes justifiable because it starts to get very vague at that point, and the climate change estimates were very uncertain. But very quickly, you can just plot using this color coding what your design level is. So again, with that red being the critical. So in this graph, you can see very quickly a lot of these beach profiles they either are under design now or they very quickly go under design. so you can start to look at when you'd need to intervene. And then we did the Overtop modeling. So you can see there's a lot of variation on this graph for that overtopping level. There's almost 100 meters cross-sectional area difference. The reason being there's a lot of very low, very long berms in this frontage. And the current overtopping equations only account for a berm up to a certain width. So essentially, if your berm is longer than that width, you've got a bigger beach, but no reduction in overtopping. So that's where, like, over time, we're hopefully trying to refine our methods to try and account for that larger berm, to try and bring some of that uncertainty down. But again, at least with the do nothing, you're not missing your worst case, which is really the most critical thing. And then we move on to flood modeling. So the main input here was our overtopping calculations. And then the underlying digital elevation model comes from LiDAR data, which is freely available. One of the links we'll send out at the end is for the Environment Agency environment data website. You can get up to 1 meter, sometimes half a meter resolution grid cells. It's a fantastic resource, sometimes a bit cumbersome to use, but free of charge. So I really recommend that. And they have that going back in time. And the regional coastal monitoring data also, that goes a lot further back in time, but obviously you only have your data on the beach. The LiDAR goes inland as well. And then, so once we've got all of this data, we've done our overtopping, we know what we're trying to stop with regards to flooding, we know what our beach trends are. We can then work out what quantity of beach material you would need each year in order to sustain your standard of protection. And you can see you need a slightly bigger quantity in year 1 to bring it all up to scratch. And then the later years are about keeping in step with the changes you would expect, accounting for climate change. And using this graph, you can very quickly decide how big a recharge you're going to do. That is bringing in fresh beach material. Basically looking at this, you decide how long do you want your scheme to last. For this scheme, we looked at 15 years because within 15 years, we're going to need to start looking at raising rear walls. So it made sense to do that. And then here's the sort of final product of the analysis, what our recommendations were. So with regard to the business case, we now know how much beach material we need. We know where it's going, so we can come up with a methodology with regards how much beach management plant you would need, how we might be able to bring the material, whether that's by barge or whether it has to be a component by road. And then you can cost that up. You already have your benefits, which you can calculate with the overtopping of flood modeling and some other data sets. You can work out what your damages are, and then you can do your economic analysis. There's far more that goes into a business case that I won't go into, but in terms of coastal monitoring data, that's the key input. You can go all the way up to economic appraisal. So it's really invaluable, really. I can't sort of overstate the wealth of data that we have in the UK and how useful that is when you're appraising and developing schemes. Great, so that's our run through. Apologise for the technical difficulties. I hope I won't crash out during questions.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to both Claire and Andy from everyone at South Eastern Branch and all of our attendees. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm sure everyone else will agree it's fascinating to see what information or what world of information there is available, particularly for free, that you can access and have a look at any point, and how that's used in real life applications to protect some of our coastlines. At the moment, there's nothing in our Q&A chat, but if Claire and Andy don't mind, I have a question to get things started. Andy, you mentioned at the end of your presentation about the wealth of information that is available. And Claire, you'd mentioned how over time that the quality and availability of that data have progressed, but there's also limitations that go with that, i.e. data management, for example. Maybe starting with Claire, what do you think the biggest limitations are for you in terms of data, and how do you maybe see that being addressed in the future?
Well, limitations for sort of current data or sort of managing it is that I think having the means to analyse it and having the tools to analyse it. And we found this even, I mean, I work for the monitoring programme and we've got all the tools to hand, but I still think there's so much that you can do with the data. But I think it's probably quite overwhelming how much data there is. I think if just looking at the South East Monitoring programme alone, you've got nearly 20 years worth of data for thousands of beach profiles. And I think the biggest thing is trying to decipher what part you actually need. The profiles and the volumetric data is essentially the same. And it's just trying to sort of work out which one's your preference. Personally, I prefer working with the volumetric data, and then that sort of comes with which I'm sure many people attending this are perfectly capable of using GIS, but it's sort of understanding the tools available and which GIS package you've got versus what you can do with it. So that's sort of one of the limitations of actually using the data. One of the other limitations for probably actual data collection is sort of the survey methods vary quite a lot, even between neighbouring beaches. How we collect our data versus how our project partners collect their data is slightly different. We don't have a UAV coverage, so some of this, or a UAV, we don't have a drone just at the moment because of environmental restrictions and weather. I mean, it's the UK, so it's obviously it's windy, it's wet, it's dark, and all of those can sort of go against it. So sometimes from that perspective, just boots on the ground is more reliable. At least you can collect the data when you need to, but the coverage is a balance, isn't it, between coverage and reliability, I guess. I think, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I think previously, correct me if I'm wrong and this has changed, we've previously spoken about this in the past. You mentioned funding and how it's really important when people are collecting that data to really share how they're using it for your funding purposes.
Yeah, sure. They did actually change that because it is so crucial. It's all very well. I mean, the data downloads, if you equate that to a monetary value, we're looking at millions. And it was all about recording that. So the coastal monitoring website's changed now, so that when you do download it, you have to say, even in just a sentence or a word, sort of who you are and what project it's being for, because the monitoring program runs in sort of 5 or 6 year phases, and we have to bid for the money to be able to continue this. And so we're always having to prove its worth. So yeah, it's making sure it's being used is fantastic, and even just using the data sort of aids its future, the extension of the program, really. Going forward though, on a different term for sort of finance, obviously it's we're always looking at making efficiencies, and sort of a part of that comes with changing of how we capture the data. So if we can go to UAVs and sort of mobile scanners and things like that, it's sort of a lot quicker to capture, but it's more expensive and slower to process, and you need real beefy machines to be able to do that. So again, with everything, it's a massive trade-off.
Yeah, there's definitely been some advancements in all of it, as you can see. You know, there's more and more technology coming out every day, so it'd be interesting to see how this progresses in the future. Andy, same questions to you. What are the key limitations do you find of the data, and how would you see maybe that changing moving forward, or how would you want it to change?
Yeah, so I guess one thing to touch upon is obviously data quality. It's true to say, because it's manually collected, the data, I suppose, at the very start, there was less expertise and it was a little bit feeling it out. But as part of the monitoring program itself, it has a very good QA. So essentially, with the Canterbury team, for instance, we'll collect the data, there'll be in-house QA, and then it goes to the Channel Coastal Observatory to then be QA'd independently. And they've got an extraordinary person who will pick up in the tiniest of details, you know, one number in a text file. So it does give you a high level of assurance. But as with any data set, including LiDAR, I just encourage anyone using it to really get to grips with it, commit at least a few days, if not weeks, at the start of your project to really looking at the data, sense checking it, making sure it is reasonable before you start doing all of your analysis on it. But obviously, QA procedures and just data collection is getting better and better over time. So that's already increasing. And then it's just, I guess, availability of data. The monitoring program is great. It doesn't cover the entire coastline, but typically coastlines that have a hold the line policy, or where you might want to do management, they hold the data. Obviously, if there's not historic data for the actual area you need, then you can't do much about that now. The fact that so much is done now, obviously from now, people looking back in 20 years' time will have even better data than we do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Then the final point is similar to the funding, is to get a plea to any other coastal managers that just paying for extra surveys. So if you actually speak to your local regional coastal monitoring team, they may well have the capacity to actually go out and survey for you. You don't have to go to a really expensive national survey company. but just having that extra data when you're looking at schemes is invaluable. The regional coastal monitoring data typically collects data twice a year, which is really good for your long-term trends. But if you're doing a scheme, just invest in maybe monthly surveys for a couple of years, and also that post sort of construction analysis, especially if you've just got millions of pounds worth of flood defence grant and aid from national government, assuring them that you are actually going to appraise how your scheme was is really valuable.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Andy, for that insight. We have a question in the Q&A from Ruben. Could you elaborate on how losses of beach material other than due to longshore transport recycling are determined to close the volume budgets?
Yes, hi
Yeah,
Ruben.
go on, Claire.
Oh, you're testing my memory now. So there's three sort of calculations that we would attribute. So once we've got our, so the first one is looking at attrition. This is primarily on a shingle beach, or the sort of abrasion between the particles. We used the study done by Uwe Dornbusch in 2003, which I think attributed a 1.5% loss. I think I need to double check that number. And so from that one, we can take the area of the polygon. The polygons for our sediment budget don't include any foreshore because we are just looking at shingle. But obviously, if you're doing sand, it would be much larger and different calculation. And so we can apply I think it's 1.5% loss across the whole area. So that's just for sort of attrition. Then we, if there's no beach management, then that's it. We wouldn't attribute any greater losses, and essentially we'd just assume that's been lost from the system. If we've been doing beach recycling, then generally the material is coming within a much sort of more local area, and the beach will be sort of semi-native. It's already been sorted through the wave action, so the loss of fines from picking that up in a dump truck, moving it along the coast and sort of redistributing it, the losses should be a lot less. So we would attribute a 5% loss of sort of fine material to the volume of beach recycled material. The losses for beach replenishment are greater if it's being brought sort of from an offshore source or sort of a land quarry. Then we would assume that material would have sort of greater number of fines in it. And I think, I mean, we did studies, not me, this was a long time ago, sort of early 90s. I think the studies were suggesting between a 15 and 18% loss sometimes on some of the beach replenishment schemes. That's quite a large value, so we don't quite go that high. But if we've done beach replenishment, we would attribute, I think it's a 10% loss based on the volume of beach replenishment brought in. It's just to account, it's trying to make the whole thing sort of realistic, really. We wouldn't suggest that absolutely nothing would be lost from sort of recycling and replenishment. And again, you're sort of reorganizing the material and bringing sort of fines to the surface, which we wouldn't expect to stay there too long. Hopefully that answers your question.
Fabulous, thank you very much, Claire. Have we got time for one more question? Got a few minutes. We've got a question from Tatiana. I don't know if Andy or Claire, are you able to see the questions?
Yep.
A longer one, save me reading it to you.
Yeah, I'm just rereading that myself. Just
okay.
to add to the final point, because I know Ruben's a modeler. With those percentages, oftentimes we can't fully close the sediment cell, so we essentially get that residual, and what we do is we just have a distance weighted factor to weight that along the entire frontage, and typically by the time you've done that, it's incredibly small sort of losses. So hopefully that answers that. So it's about habitat creation. Sorry, just rereading it. I think my very quick answer, without being an expert on this, is yes. The same sort of analysis that we're doing for this could absolutely definitely be used for these things. So, and it's actually something that I really want to get more into, because especially natural flood management in general is becoming more mainstream, which is a great thing in this country. But still, I think inland natural flood management is far better known and perhaps more used than coastal, I guess typically because on the coast, you will be on a much bigger scale. What you're creating is going to have to stand up to the effects of the sea. And especially where you've got hard defences, often habitat creation comes at the expense of perhaps losing defences or even losing sort of developable land. So it's always going to be a hard political sell, but I'd hope that we can move forward where we at least start quantifying where we can do this stuff. And there are some brilliant data sets the Environment Agency holds, such as on salt marsh potential areas. I believe they might be published on the same environment data website that we're going to be posting in our presentation.
The links, yeah. So as mentioned by Claire and Andy, there'll be some links shared in the chat, so everybody can access some of the data sets that we've been talking about today. Sorry, Claire, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to attack on the end of that. We haven't really talked about it because the focus of our sort of frontage is sort of heavily engineered, really, but the monitoring program does have habitat mapping, which should, and I think they do that every 5 years based on the aerophotography. We get an external consultant to sort of look at it and designate different habitats and salt marsh and that sort of mapping instead. So although we haven't talked about it, there is data available for that. So hopefully that would assist further in any sort of salt marsh analysis as well.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. So it's now 1:30. Just want to say again a massive thank you to Claire and Andy for their time. And an amazing presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to try and get in touch. We can pass those on. Everybody have a fantastic day.